Russell Brand, Narcissist, Part 13. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. As the controversy surrounding Russell Brand rumbles on, we look at what is he? Before I turn to the issue of the impact of various diagnoses in relation to what he is, here's a further excerpt from his autobiography. He writes, "My mum getting ill, Colin, his stepfather, turning up, then my dad, with the best of intentions and a pocket full of transitory cash, deciding to send me to a posh private school called Gidea Park. Academically, I would inevitably lag behind the privileged elite of Gidea Park College, so my dad arranged for me to have private tuition with the bloke next door to him, who looked a bit like the former Labour Party leader, Michael Foot. It wasn't actually him. He was a beautiful and idealistic man. They just looked similar. Once, when I got a question right, this chap, by way of congratulation, stuck his finger up my arse and felt my balls. This is unusual, I thought. I wondered if perhaps I might have encouraged him, because I'd said something I'd heard on Only Fools and Horses. To describe my bafflement at a mathematical problem, I'd employed a phrase which Del Boy used, "Rodney, I've been looking for you like a tit in a trance," only changing tit, which I knew was rude, to clown. "But it's not clown in a trance, is it?" he responded, lasciviously. By referring to this lewd colloquialism, it seemed I'd signalled my complicity in the world of adult sexuality. Just a few moments later, he was copping a feel and besmirching the purity of what would later become popularly known as my ball bags. As a currency for rewarding academic achievement, I think it's unlikely to supersede the gold star. Although I thought it odd, I wasn't particularly cheesed off. What most aggrieved me about the whole sorry business was that soon after it happened, I told my mum. She in turn told my dad, who didn't go to the police because he said he'd deal with it, but he never did anything. Later in life, when he would sometimes drunkenly allude to parenting errors in a "sorry I wasn't a good dad" kind of way, I often felt this was what he was referring to. And if he'd beaten the old poor sod up, or something, I would have seen that as an act of heroism. I didn't see that tutor again, one hopes, on account of his bizarre antics. This recollection may well be another contribution to a lack of control environment that Brand was exposed to, not only with regard to the sexual assault by a tutor, but also the impotence of both his mother and father to seek redress on his behalf. In an interview in 2006, the interviewer wrote, "The thing you get most of all from Brand is the strange cocktail of ambition and vulnerability, which could spell danger for this battle-hardened self-saboteur. I've always had this impulse to be destructive," says Brand. "I'm more on my guard now, but I've always had this thing in me, a bacchanalian impulse. The thing that says there's only this, there's only now, there's nothing else, so fuck everything. I still have little explosions of it, but I have to say to myself, remember, you've got all these things to do. Don't ruin it just for the moment." This suggests an individual who very much lives in the moment and is guided by it. However, does there appear to be some reflection on how that is and how he tackles it, or is he simply saying that for the purposes of impressing the interviewer? Two further snippets which shed further light on Russell Brand. We now turn to the issue of the impact of being a drug addict and other diagnoses in relation to what Russell Brand is. Brand was a drug addict. He extensively took cocaine, heroin, ecstasy, amongst other substances, and this evidently had an impact upon his behaviour. From early adolescence, Brand was suspected to be bipolar and hypermanic, though he was actually only treated for depression. In 2009, Brand further discussed his teenage battle with bulimia in an interview with Time Out Sydney. When asked whether he'd been diagnosed with other mental illnesses, he said, "Yes, depression and manic depression, and more latterly bipolar. attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity. It's difficult to know which of those diagnoses are correct because most of the time I was very young and on drugs. He's also previously spoken about experiencing extreme moods, which are part of bipolar disorder. I've never had a sustained period of medication for mental illness when I've not been on other drugs as well, he said. It's just not something that I particularly feel I need. I know that I have dramatically changing moods, and I know sometimes I feel really depressed. But I think that's just life. I don't think of it as, this is mental illness, more as, today life makes me feel very sad. I know I also get unnaturally high levels of energy and quickness of thought, but I'm able to utilize that. Might it be that when he talks about these high levels of energy, this is as a consequence of the receipt of fuel? Is the quickness of thought a product of his natural intelligence? Or is there some embellishment and boasting associated with it also? When he talks about feeling depressed, might there be some depression which could be a comorbid condition, or is it simply a symptom of reduced fuel levels that he's experiencing? It is clear that having a drug addiction would have two impacts. First, it will result in a series of behaviours which could result in the misdiagnosis of conditions. And secondly, such behaviours would indeed cause him to behave in a way which might also be interpreted as narcissism. For example, he would act with a sense of entitlement whilst on drugs, that he would be more grandiose as a consequence of the confidence that is imbued from taking drugs, that his emotional empathy, if it exists, would be reduced by his drug taking. Drugs is one of those things that acts as an internal stressor. The act of taking drugs is an act of reduced accountability, and furthermore will induce additional behaviours which show an absence of accountability. And therefore, the firm question arises, is his drug taking a manifestation of something else, or are the symptoms of his behaviour coming from the drug taking? Well, with regard to the manic depression and bipolar, that may well be a correct diagnosis. But it is important to note that repeatedly narcissists use bipolar as an excuse for their behaviour. It's a subtle form of blame shifting. I can't help what I do, it's my bipolar. And in some instances, the presentation of behaviour to a medical professional is mistakenly identified as bipolar disorder when it is not. Whilst it is very clear that Brand experiences repeated periods of hyperactive behaviour, manic behaviours, he also repeatedly behaves in a way where there is an absence of emotional empathy alongside these episodes. Further, and this is most important, by his own admission, those diagnoses were made when he was on drugs, which would certainly obscure and impact on the diagnoses. Yet, he has been clean to his credit since 2002, and therefore it would be instructive to reconsider his behaviours as briefly as possible post-2002 and see if there is a vast change in them. If it's the case that much of the troublesome behaviour that has been experienced was prior to 2002, this may well be as a consequence of drug use solely, and therefore would point away from it being narcissism. In 2002, he got into trouble from reading pornography out loud on XFM. In 2014, Brand confessed to Oprah Winfrey that he was infatuated with pornography, and he was later forgiven by Radio X and was rehired as a presenter in 2017, promising that he would offer joy, unity, and togetherness. During his period of time and working on Radio 6, post-2002, he repeatedly behaved in an aggressive and abusive way towards his colleagues, throwing objects across the studio in fits of rage and urinating in a bottle in front of others. In 2006, he insulted Bob Geldof on stage by referring to him as Sir Bobby Gandalf. The gag wasn't welcome because there were unfounded rumours that Brand had been involved with Geldof's daughter Peaches, and therefore, when Geldof arrived on stage, he declared Russell Brand What a cunt. Brand came back with a witty retort, stating, really it's no surprise that he, Geldof, is such an expert on famine. He has been dining out on I Don't Like Mondays for 30 years. He later fell out with Geldof's daughter, Fifi, in 2015 after making inappropriate jokes about drug taking at, of all things, a narcotics and alcohol addiction charity fundraiser. Saxgate took place in 2008, which you'll recall is when Brand and Ross telephoned veteran Fawlty Towers actor Andrew Sachs to gloat that Brand had had a brief relationship with his granddaughter, Georgina Bailey, and left a series of strange aggressive messages that, including Brand singing, "It was consensual and she wasn't menstrual." In 2008, he insulted George W. Bush by referring to him as the retarded cowboy fella. He urged at the time, in 2008, when presenting the MTV Video Awards, people to vote for Barack Obama, and said of claims that America was too racist to elect a black president, "I know America to be a forward-thinking country, because otherwise, why would you have let that retard and cowboy fella be president for 8 years?" He also laid into the Jonas Brothers for their much-cherished purity rings, holding one up and saying that he had won it from one of the brothers backstage. When this was met with booing, he said, "I'd like to take this opportunity to say no one ever have sex again. It's a mad idea. What a way to spend an evening." In 2010, he joked about drugs. In an interview with Rolling Stone, he said, "The top of the hit parade would look very different if teeny poppers were exposed to heroin. It would weed a lot of them out." There was, of course, the relationship with Katy Perry, which was short-lived, that he divorced her just after 14 months, sending her a text on New Year's Eve 2011, telling her that the marriage was over. He later described their marriage as a time that I remember as being a little bit chaotic, and Perry has remained largely silent about the marriage, albeit has alluded to some darker behaviours. He caused outrage at the GQ Awards in 2013 when he took to the stage entirely sober and remarked that the event sponsor Hugo Boss had made fucking fantastic uniforms for the Nazis before ostentatiously goose-stepping, much to the horror of the audience. We heard earlier that even when married, he plays little of a part with regard to assisting his wife with the children, stating, "I'm focused on the mystical connotations of Mabel's beauty and grace, not so good on the nappies and making sure that they eat food." That's just a selection of behaviours that have taken place while he has been sober. And you can see that he acts with a sense of entitlement, a lack of emotional empathy for those around him, that he doesn't show accountability for his behaviours, that he belittles and invalidates individuals. I haven't included also the allegations of sexual misconduct against him post-2002, but if we were to add those in, that would also show repeated instances of a sense of entitlement, manipulative behaviour, an absence of accountability, and an absence of emotional empathy, and haughty behaviour towards other people. But even if we don't include the recent allegations about sexual misconduct, there is still plenty there that shows that post-2002, when he was clean, he was still, for want of a better description, misbehaving. His behaviours have continued post-drug use. Therefore, drug use was not the sole cause of the behaviour, but rather one of many symptoms of something else. Thus, he hasn't behaved in the way that he does because he's taken drugs. He behaves in the way that he does because of something else, and his drug taking was as a consequence of something else. He no longer drinks or takes drugs. Therefore, that particular symptom has fallen away. The reason why that is, I will explain in a later part. The diagnoses were made when he was a drug user, and therefore may have been obscured by his drug use. Given the fact that the behaviours have continued post-drug use, this may therefore suggest that these diagnoses may well be accurate. It is unclear whether Brand has experienced depression post-2002. If he has, this could be a comorbid condition with something else, or perhaps, as I mentioned earlier, a result of diminished fuel levels. The diagnosis of ADHD also occurred during his drug use, and since he now presents as a calmer individual, it might well be the case that his ADHD was drug-induced, or it might be that it coexists with other conditions. With regard to the suggestion of bipolar, as I explained earlier, bipolar is sometimes used by narcissists as an excuse for their behaviour as part of their blame shifting. We have repeated instances where his drug-free and alcohol-free behaviour shows an absence of emotional empathy, which would suggest that bipolar is not applicable. Accordingly, I do not see that depression, manic depression, bipolar, ADHD are attributable to his behaviours over his lifetime, but rather some of which rose on a drug-induced basis or sit alongside another condition which is actually the main driver of his behaviour. Before we get to the conclusion as to what Russell is, we're going to examine an interesting episode between him and his father in part 14. Join me there.